everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and my hair is slowly eating my face. Tonight, I wanted to stay topical as always with the road and talk about a chess player who's been recently talked about quite a bit online, and that is Hikaru Nakamura. Of course, Hikaru has made quite a name for himself in the streaming world and is pretty solidly cemented as one of the best, if not the best, online rapid and blitz player of all time. But tonight I wanted to take it back a little bit in time to Hikaru's slightly earlier days before he joined the chess.com and twitch.tv crew and talk about his over-the-board career and where it is at now and where it was at about 10 to 5 years ago. So many of you might know that Hikaru actually peaked at number 2 in the world, and that was all the way back in 2015. He was well above 2,800, I think he was like 2,814 or something, and number 2 in the world, second only to Magnus Carlsen. And they actually have a very interesting over-the-board record, and that's what I want to jump into tonight. So we're going to take a look at what happened between Magnus and Hikaru back in the early 2010s and see the conclusion of that rivalry. Let's take a look. So to start with, I want to show you a pretty typical game between Magnus and Hikaru way back in the day. So the story tonight is going to be Hikaru's sort of mental block against Magnus. For some reason, whatever reason it may be, even when Hikaru was at his best, he seemed to have some sort of block against Magnus Carlsen, just couldn't get a win in against the guy, and was struggling with games like these. So here Magnus had the white pieces, and we're going to take a look at d4, d5, c4, c6. Oh, and by the way, let me check the tags, let you know where this game was played. This was the Sinquefield Cup in September of 2014. I was getting my games mixed up. So this one, September 2014 Sinquefield Cup. We get not c takes d4, we get knight c3, and this move is sort of asking for d takes c4. I myself with white pieces here like to go knight f3, keep it a little bit simpler. That way, if black has any clever ideas about taking on c4, I'm a little bit better prepared to deal with recapturing this pawn. For example, after b5, I can go a4, and I don't have to worry about b4 attacking my knight. On the other hand here, Magnus plays the move 3, knight to c3. And now after d takes c4, we're going to see a very similar line. But after a4, black does in fact have this move b4, hitting the knight on c3. So what does this mean for white's position? Well, it means if you play like this, you just have to be a little bit more prepared. These lines are fine for white from what I can tell, but you do have to know a little bit of theory, which of course Magnus does in this case. This knight has to move. You can actually move it to pretty much any of these 3 squares, but knight e4 is the main line. Might as well stick the knight in the center. Now we get queen to d5, hitting the knight and pressuring g2 a little bit, and Magnus actually brings this knight back to d2, just already increasing the pressure on this pawn. No messing around, we just want to take our pawn back. However, black has further ideas here, and Hikaru simply pushes the pawn further down the board. bc3, bc3, and now it looks like it is actually going to be a little bit annoying for white to regain this pawn. And so white's knight completes its little round trip here and heads back to b1. Of course, it's every chess player's goal to move the knight 4 times by move 9. Just one of those funny lines where it seems like both sides are wasting a lot of time, but this is the kind of funny business that you have to do in order to regain the c-pawn in this line. Anytime that white is wasting by moving the knight around, black is also actually spending this time trying to keep the pawn alive. So it's not as if Magnus is making some great sacrifice in time here, because Hikaru is also spending just as much time to keep the pawn alive. And to that point, we see Hikaru actually move the queen again over to a5, again just trying to keep this pawn alive and keep himself in the game. Now we see queen to c2, and very, very surprisingly, Hikaru plays a pretty serious inaccuracy here. So the main line is actually going to be knight to a6 here. It's just time for black to give up on this pawn. No reason to keep fighting for it. You don't actually expect to keep the pawn when you play d takes c4 in the Slav. And here, white can play something like queen c3. And the best game I could find here was actually a game between Alexander Kosteniuk And let's see who else it was here. Oh, and Girya had the white pieces against Alexander Kosteniuk. And that game went like this. Black just sticks this knight onto b4, and with the support of the queen and the bishop, it's actually quite difficult to remove this knight. And then both sides are going to get developed here. Knight f3, knight f6, bishop c4. Obviously, the knight is preventing the bishop from going to the natural d3 square. We see both sides get castled, rook to c1. And at the end of the day, black is going to be just in time to break with this move c5. And when the dust settles after c5 and these two pawns get traded, black is pretty much equal. If you can achieve this in the Slav, you have pretty much equalized. Negating white's central advantage, opening the lines for your own pieces, and in this case, black is perfectly fine. So what did Hikaru do instead? Well, instead of knight a6, Hikaru tries to keep the pawn with a little bit of a tricky move in the form of e5. Of course, what black is hoping for here is, if you're really dumb, you play queen takes c3, and lose the queen, but I think Hikaru was specifically hoping for knight takes c3, when of course white isn't losing, but you do get a little bit more fun than in the other line. Rather than just equalizing, black is applying quite a bit of pressure to the dark squares in white's camp, and is going to saddle white with this isolated pawn, and perhaps black will be the first to castle, the first on the e-file, and white is going to have some work to do to get back into this game. But of course, Magnus Carlsen had something better in mind. And I don't know if this was actually prep by Magnus. I imagine it could have been, because e5 seems like a move that you should check if you're playing this. But this move basically just gives white an advantage. And this is why it's so surprising to see Hikaru making this move pawn to e5. Now, I don't want to, speculate too much as to why Hikaru makes these strange decisions against Magnus, or made these strange decisions way back in the day, but this is not such an uncommon theme. You see Hikaru doing something a little bit funky, as he was known to do sometimes, but against Magnus, it just doesn't ever work out, right? Magnus just finds good chess moves. But chat room here, how do we gain an advantage with white after this move, e5? How do we gain an advantage with the white pieces? What to do? And someone in the chat was guessing bishop f5. I don't think those tactics actually work. We can just take, and if you play c2, I can move the knight to block the check and remove it from the threat of capture. So those tactics not so good for black. So basically, the point of white's next move is that it makes black's plan of knight a6 to b4 a lot less feasible. It makes it so that this idea is not going to be so workable, at least in the immediate future. And this is why e5 is a little bit of a mistake. So what can we do to make knight a6 to b4 a little bit less feasible or reasonable, whatever you want to say? Seen a lot of moves being suggested here, but none of them really get to the point. Yeah, a lot of ideas in the chat, and all these moves I think are, maybe okay, but if you just play some normal developing move like knight a3, bishop c4, black is still going to take on the d4 pawn and open up this e-file, and again, black is maybe going to have the better side of things with white having this isolated queen's pawn and having a little bit of work to do in order to complete development with this annoying pawn still on c3. So knight takes again, just the same plan by black is going to be perfectly fine there. We're going to take on d4, play bishop b4, and have a little bit of pressure. Yeah, queen e4 is a little bit too much. What you want to do here is develop your pieces and prevent black's natural plan. And the way to do that is actually with the simple move, knight to f3. Why is this move so strong? Well, first and foremost, you're threatening to win a pawn, and if black continues with what seemed to be the plan here of e takes d4, we're simply going to take back with the knight. And the point now is that we don't have this isolated pawn to worry about. Our e-file remains closed and our king remains safe. And now we're actually applying a little bit of pressure to the c6 pawn as well. So a move like knight a6 now is going to be very difficult to achieve with all this pressure on c6. So sometimes the simple move is correct here, and you just want to find these multi-purpose developing moves that also hamper the development from the opponent. So that's generally the best you can hope for in the opening. Sometimes you can just win material outright, but you want to find the best way to develop that keeps your king safe and also hampers your opponent's development. So always be on the lookout for these kinds of ideas. And so Hikaru was actually unhappy with this line that keeps this knight on b8 sort of hemmed in. Of course, you can play something like bishop b7 or bishop d7 here, but then you really are asking for some trouble in the form of something like queen to e4 check on occasion. Also just simple development here, and this stuff with knight b4 is just coming a bit too slowly now that white is able to castle. Now knight b4 is actually no good because we can just take. I actually forgot to mention in the other line there was a knight c2 tactic, taking advantage of the king on e1. So knight a6 just isn't really feasible. So Hikaru was actually so unhappy with this development in the opening that he decided, you know what, I'm just sacrificing this e5 pawn, which makes some sense, but at the same time is going to cause some serious trouble. So Magnus goes ahead and captures, but now Hikaru is getting this knight to b4 idea in. The problem here for Hikaru is that it's like the normal line, except, you know, he doesn't have an e-pawn. And e-pawns are generally pretty useful, believe it or not. So white is just significantly better here with the extra e-pawn. And this is the type of strange game that Hikaru would really only get against Magnus Carlsen. You never really saw Hikaru making these mistakes, these early opening blunders against anybody but Magnus. At least that's the way I remember it. And so white does still have some work to do here, I should mention. Of course, if we play queen takes c3, there is still this winning idea by black of knight to c2 check, and the queen is actually pinned, and the knight delivers check. So queen takes is illegal, the king has to move, and then of course black is picking up the rook on a1. So queen c3, not going to cut it, but Magnus simply slides out of the way with queen to b3, not hampering the development of this bishop, and now it's just simply winning for white. The game continues with bishop e6, and from here on out it's smooth sailing. Bishop c4 for Magnus, c2. Simply knight to d2 is perfectly fine for white here, it's +3 in winning, but Magnus of course finds the best continuation, which is to actually just capture on e6, with the idea being that if black tries to queen here, we're just going to take, and this king is entirely busted up here. There's no knight c2 anymore because the rook is no longer on a1. So we get knight to d3 check instead. King to e2 is the idea. See a trade of knights on e5, and finally black just captures on e6 rather than allow bishop f7 with check. We get knight to e7, and now after knight to d2, like it's pretty simple here. This pawn on c2 is more of a weakness now than it is a strength. Black's king is stuck in the center, and it's just busted. Queen d5 was the forced move by Hikaru. You have to get rid of this active queen on e6, but unfortunately white is just simply up material here. We saw takes, knight e4, and Magnus converts this one pretty easily. I don't want to spend too much more time here. Knight f3 to e1, and this pawn will fall. We see many chess moves and a winning rook endgame to top it off. Just too much went wrong in the opening here for Hikaru. And finally, we see resigns in the king and pawn endgame. Of course, king e4 is unplayable due to f6. Same with king f4, and that'll be the match. So that is the first kind of typical Magnus Hikaru game that I wanted to show. For some reason, Hikaru just never really could get off the ground in many of these games. Now, that's not to say Hikaru never had any chances, and I'm about to show you what might be the saddest game of Hikaru Nakamura's career. And of course, that's me guessing. We all have many sad games in our chess careers, but I struggle to think of a game sadder than this for Hikaru Nakamura. I think at this point, Hikaru's record against Magnus was something like 0 wins, 8 or 9 losses, and, you know, of course, a slew of draws, as all the top players have against each other. And then he comes out and he plays this game. So this one, of course, was played at the Zurich Chess Challenge in 2014. And this time we see Hikaru with the white pieces. So what does Hikaru do? He plays d4. We get knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. And wouldn't you know it, Hikaru plays the f3 Nimzo. That's right. Hikaru knows. Hikaru knows what's up. He knows what he has to do in order to take down the world champ. And in this case, he chooses the f3 Nimzo, one of my favorite openings. And Magnus plays the move d5. Now, I've spoken a lot about these lines in my Chess Openings Explained lecture series, and we're actually going to see Magnus adopt a line that I was not so fond of. We're going to see him play the strange-looking move, bishop back to e7. So the quote-unquote main line, the most common line, goes with bishop takes c3. And then really I think the only way for black to equalize is with this knight takes d5 line. I don't so much like the e takes d5 stuff. For black, I think white gets an advantage in most of these lines. But instead, we see bishop e7. And this is actually a very, very interesting line with the idea of allowing white to expand in the center with pawn to e4, but in return, going for immediate counterplay on the open dark squares. And this is going to be pretty different than the 4c5 lines, because in the lines where black plays 4 to c5, we get a closed type of center where, yes, black is fighting for the dark squares, but, you know, everything is remaining pretty locked down, and we're going to wait for some pawn breaks to open things up. Now compare that to this line when things are immediately going to be getting opened. We see de4, ed4, and now there's actually two moves here. In my database, the Lead Chess database, e5, which was played in this game, has been played over 300 times. Meanwhile, c5, the other way of challenging the dark squares, has been played just 19 times. However, I'm of the opinion that c5 is a much better move, and black is in pretty serious trouble after the quote-unquote main line of e5. Of course, c5 making an appearance in this year's, well, I guess last year's, now extending into this year's candidates tournament between Fabiano Caruana with whites and Alexeyenko with black. And Fabi ended up winning this game, but Alexeyenko had a very decent position out of the opening. In this case, though, we're talking about e5, the much more common move, and the move Magnus chose in this game. We get d5, now bishop c5. And like I said, compared to the 4c5 lines, we see all these open lines of attack into the position for black. Now, the trick to this line, and we're going to see that Hikaru manages to navigate this pretty well, is to make sure black never gets permanent control over the d4 square. If black is able to sort of cement the pieces into d4, then white is not going to be any better. But if you follow the line that I recommended in Chess Openings Explained, white should get some advantage. And I actually recommended starting with knight f3. In the game, we see Hikaru choosing bishop g5 instead. And here I think black definitely should play h6 with the idea of getting an early bishop d4 in. In this case, though, Magnus simply castles. And now we're going to transpose to the knight f3 lines. And we see here bishop g4 by Magnus. h3 by white is the common response. We see takes, takes, and knight b to d7. And now the point is that black is simply not going to be able to maintain this bishop on d4 without making a pretty major concession. And we'll see that in a few moves. So the story of this game is basically going to be that white castles queenside and is able to pretty much keep the queenside locked down for the most part. In the meantime, we see white with all this pressure down the f-file and able essentially to just rip things open on the king's side. And Hikaru more or less coasts to an easily winning position here. We do see bishop d4 by the world champion, but now the problem is that after knight e2, there's no good way to maintain this bishop. We see in this case, Magnus opts for the very double-edged move of c5. So the huge upside to c5 is that yes, you get to keep this bishop here, but this is exactly what white wants to see. After black commits to this move of c5, there's not a good way to open things up to attack on the queen side of the board. You kind of need this pawn in order to play a move like c6 and open up the c file in order to attack. In fact, the computer here recommends something like the move Rook E8, and just actually sacrificing this pawn outright and going for these c6 ideas in the near future. It would rather do this than play c5 and lock things down. Pretty sad stuff, in my opinion. Pretty sad stuff. So c5 locking things down, Magnus wants to keep the pawn and the bishop on d4. We see g4 by white, a5 now by black, but of course this is not going to be enough for active counterplay on the queen side. White now plays simple chess, king to b1. And I just want to say for reference here, this is like +1.5 to +2 for white, but against the world champion, there is still a lot of chess left to be played, and we're going to see Hikaru actually find some really, really nice moves. So I just want to point that out. We're not coasting to a win just yet. It's just that strategically, our plan is very easy to play with white, and Magnus is going to have to work very, very, very hard in order to create threats on the queen side. However, we'll see that he does have some good ideas. Rook A6 is a classic way of both defending your king side and lifting the rook for some tactics in many F3 Nimzo lines, actually. And we see Magnus employing that here. This was the point of A5, but simply knight G3 is just way too easy for white. Look at all of these holes in black's position. G6 now by Magnus is kind of forced. You just can't let this knight exist on the F5 or H5 squares. But now, of course, the G6 pawn is what's known as a hook. So I guess I'll turn it over to the chat room here. How should we take advantage of this pawn on G6? What should we do? How do you take advantage of this pawn coming to G6? And yeah, Great Wolf has the right idea. It's called a hook because it's something you can sort of grab onto, and rather than, a fish getting baited by a hook, in this case we're just going to latch onto it and use it to open up things like the H file. So H4, H5 with ideas of taking on G6 at the right moment is exactly what we should have in mind. So of course Hikaru continues now with H4. We see A4 by the world champion, and this is where Hikaru starts sort of showing his stuff here. He finds some really interesting moves that I personally would likely not think to play. So H5 looks pretty natural in this situation, but in fact, Magnus is making a pretty devious threat with this move pawn to A4. Now after Rook B6, Black is gaining a tempo against B2, and he's actually looking to plop this rook onto the third rank here and use the active counterplay on the queen's side in order to force some pieces off the board. So of course we can't move this queen out of the way, or else we are falling for some, well, okay, this hangs our queen. Yeah, so we can't move the queen out of the way because this hangs rook takes b2. And if we play the move rook d3, Magnus, I think, is simply planning to play queen b6. And what's the point? Well, the point now is that we have threats here, and Hikaru, or Magnus in this case, is just looking to trade off some pieces to sort of lessen the blow of the kingside attack. So anticipating all of this, after the move a4, Hikaru actually doesn't play h5. He plays the subtle move rook h2. And as far as I can tell, the point of this move is simply to defend the b2 pawn in anticipation of the move rook b6. But on top of that, it's always nice to have the rooks sort of on different files, different ranks in these sorts of fluid positions, because it makes it very, very easy to double them up at a moment's notice. Now, of course, if rook to b6 were going to be played, what do you think we should do, chat room? We played rook h8, rook h2 in anticipation of this move. So what can we do if rook to b6 now? What can we do? What's the point? What was the point? Yeah, Strafeist has the right idea with rook d3. Again, we are sort of just playing the moves we had to play as a response, and the other line, we're just playing them first in this case. And now, of course, Rook b3 is going to be suboptimal on account of the pawn hanging. And here, Black's counterplay is sort of just entirely snubbed. Like, there's nothing that you can really achieve here with Black. So we see Magnus changing plans at this point, acknowledging that Rook b6 is not really going to work. Magnus just plays queen to a5. And this is the type of attack I like to call putting all your pieces on one side of the board and hoping for the best. That seems to be the idea Magnus Carlsen has in this case. Just, put all the pieces on the queen side and we'll come up with some threats later. A strategy I know well. And here, Hikaru again finds a very nice move. I myself would be tempted to just play something like h5 directly, but Hikaru finds the most accurate way, playing bishop d2 first, making sure this queen is on a less active square, such as c7. And now we're going to see Hikaru actually push g5 and then h5. The knight comes back to e8, and finally we see this move h5 that we had been waiting so long to play, making sure the move order was perfectly accurate. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a second, this bishop interferes with this rook. Why doesn't Black play Rook b6 and Rook b3? And the answer is Black does play Rook b6 and Rook b3, but the difference now is that we've played g5, and rather than being forced to play Rook d3 and trade off some pieces, we just go Queen g4 and continue the attack. Magnus now brings the knight over. Again, put all the pieces on the queen side and hope you can make a threat someday. Bishop e2 is now Hikaru's response, again, perhaps preparing to double rooks. We see knight to d6 now, and look out everybody, Magnus finally made a threat. He's going to take the c4 pawn, but the bad news for Magnus Carlsen here is that taking the c4 pawn does not quite come with the blow that's about to come down the h-file. So far, Hikaru has played the simplest chess of all time. Just provoked a weakness on the king's side in the form of this hook on g6, and then found the accurate way to take advantage of the hook, and this is simply leading to a win for the white pieces. Rook d to h1 is Hikaru's idea, and now, of course, if you do take on c4, you can expect a capture and a capture on g6, and you simply can't take this pawn back. If you take back with the f pawn, you're in store for queen e6 check. And, okay, even queen takes g6 here, and of course Rook h7 is mate here, and it's all so bad. It's all so bad. Even Rook h7 is winning in this case. So rather than knight takes c4, let's put on our swindler's hats from last week and see how Magnus tried to create some chances here. So if you're Black, you are staring down some very scary rooks on the h-file, and you need to find some way to create some practical chances. So what do you guys think in the chat room? We're trying to swindle our way out of this one. Hello to Manny in the chat. How do we start swindling here? Knight b takes c4. I just talked about that line, Manny. It's not so good. You get checkmated in like 8 moves. Not so good. Sacrifice bishop, exactly, Andrew and Goat. When in doubt, just throw away some pieces and make your opponent think a little bit. So bishop takes b2 is a pretty nice swindling try. If white gets a little bit too crazy and takes on g6 here, we actually are getting a draw in this case with bishop takes c1 check, and now finally knight b takes c4. How is this going to be a draw? Well, we simply aren't going to get there on the king's side in time. We're just not breaking through with any kind of immediate checkmate. And it's actually white who needs to be a little bit careful with the king's safety here. Now, of course, no sane player is ever taking on g6 here. You just take the free bishop. And so that's what we see in the game. And now we actually do see knight b takes c4. Of course, bishop takes c4 should be played to make sure that our bishop on b2 is defended. Now we get knight takes c4 and h takes g6. So let's continue the swindle here. How do we keep up the pressure as Magnus Carlsen? How do we keep up the pressure here? Yeah, Manny has the right idea. Just queen b6, you know, just make threats. Just make threats and hope is basically the game plan here for Magnus. And Hikaru continues playing good moves at this point. So there are many, many ways to win the game here. Pretty much everything is fine, but we see the nice move g7 by Hikaru, accurately calculating that after rook takes b2 check, you simply play king to a1, and there's nothing doing here for black. There's simply nothing to be done. There's no funny checkmates anywhere. If you take h2, white captures back. Your rook is going to be hanging if you move this knight, and it's just winning for white. So g7, nice move by Hikaru. I want to highlight that this move is awful. Okay, this move is terrible and is actually probably losing the game. So this is probably what Magnus was hoping for. Maybe, you know, in some world, Hikaru goes a little bit crazy and plays g takes h7. But this is a really important idea to be aware of. We wanted to use g6 as a hook to open the h file. So after h takes g, queen b6, the last thing we want to do is play g takes h, because after king to h8, now suddenly we've closed the h file again. And black is, you know, actually quite safe on h8 here, because we have closed down the file. So important to note, g takes h7, that's like the one way to ruin this game. We get g7 instead, rook d8, Magnus not yet capturing on b2, and simply queen to h4 is again the right idea by Hikaru. In this case, Magnus is going to get to take the piece back with rook takes b2. Again, we have to play king to a1 here. Captures is checkmate, obviously. But after king to a1, black is now left with these problems on h7. Rook takes h2 for the moment interferes with these pieces, but after rook takes h2, now queen to g6 is forced, and knight to f5 is just quite sad, really, for black's position. We see this knight coming in. The queen threatens to take on h7. The knight threatens to fork the king and queen with knight to e7. And as a result, pretty much all of black's pieces are going to be entirely immobilized here. Magnus has to play this move, rook to e8, in order to stop knight e7. So the queen can't move due to checkmate, the king just can't legally move, and now the rook can't move due to knight e7. And so black is essentially playing without any pieces aside from this knight. And now is when things get a little bit awkward for Hikaru. He plays this move queen g4, which is perfectly fine. It doesn't really do anything to improve the position, and you might note that by removing the threat of checkmate, the black queen is also now allowed to move. So we see queen b6. Hikaru adjusts the queen back to h3 now. The queen has to come back, no other way to deal with this threat. And now we see Hikaru blow it all. So, white to move and not win. Can you find the move that blows the win here, everybody? Can you find the move? Knight e7 doesn't win. Accurate story. This one can be taken, and this is not checkmate due to king g7. But, you know, Hikaru's a little bit above blundering pieces. Knight h6, okay, so knight h6 is actually also winning for white, according to the computer. It's definitely not my choice, but apparently this one is surprisingly also good enough to win, because queen d7 is going to be quite strong here. And, like, you know, the pieces are still just quite strong for white here. So knight h6, not the best move. Doesn't lose the game, though. So Jimmy and Adam have both found the move that doesn't win. Hikaru plays this move d6, which is actually quite tempting. It's quite a tempting move, right? You notice that this piece can't move and that this piece can't move. And after you notice that, you're sort of tempted to play d7 and force one of them to move, right? That's the basic idea here. The problem is that in this case, black actually has a very clever way to sort of escape most of the problems facing his position here. And so it might seem very clear to you that this pawn is attacked twice and only defended once, but the story actually isn't that simple. So it does turn out that knight takes d6 is the only move, but of course after knight takes d6, queen takes d6 would be a little bit of a mistake due to queen takes h7 with checkmate. So in fact, after knight takes d6, Magnus has to find something better. So why isn't black just losing here down a piece? What's the story? What's going on? What's going on here? And yeah, goat again has the right move. It's rook to d8. And now, unfortunately, Hikaru is in this very, very strange spot where rook d1 check is actually kind of a problem. Actually kind of a major problem here for white. You really wouldn't expect it with this queen sort of sidelined all the way over on g6. But things are going to get pretty awkward pretty quickly for white if you play something like knight f5. So knight f5, and white is actually the one that's getting checkmated. Rook d1 check comes in. You can't step to b2, otherwise queen b6, queen b1 comes in. And if you step to a2, surprise, surprise, you're not actually defending the e6 square. And pretty quickly now, you are going to get checkmated in the exact same manner, with queen b3 coming in at the end. And incredibly, there's just no good response to this for white. If you play something like rook d2, yes, you defend the knight, but you've given up on this threat of queen takes h7, and now, of course, black can, in fact, just capture this knight on d6 because you don't have checkmate in the end anymore. And there's just no good solution here. There's just nothing that white can really do to keep up the pressure now. Hikaru tries the move knight to c4, which is a good effort because now rook d1 check, king a2 is playable because queen e6 is not check. But again now, Magnus finds a good move. Because this knight didn't come back to f5, simply queen takes e4 is on the board, still keeping an eye on h7 and beginning to swarm around this white king. And here is where it goes from bad to worse. So already white is in quite a bit of danger here. You have to find some accurate moves in order to stay in the game. My personal favorite way of staying in the game would have been knight to b2, fianchettoing the knight. And the idea here is simply that you need to control these entry points for the black rook. But apparently knight to e3 is perhaps the best way of going about this. It just feels a little bit more loose to cut off your queen's access to the third rank. Apparently though, this is fine for white. Instead, we see Hikaru play queen to h5, which is just, you know, very much a step in the wrong direction. You're vacating the third rank, and you're actually, yes, defending the first rank, but you're allowing the black pieces to get into the game. So, black to move and win in this position, from plus like a billion to black winning in 2 short moves. 3 short moves, I guess. What do I mean by fianchettoing the knight? I mean putting the knight on a square where a bishop would be fianchetted. Okay, rook d1, not going to do it. That was the point of queen h5. Rook d1, not going to do it, guys. This is why Hikaru played this move. Queen d4 or c4. So queen c4 is going to hang checkmate. Queen d4 is check, but I think white can maybe... Oh, sorry, not king to b1, just play knight b2 there as well against queen d4. Yeah, rook d1, not that winning, it turns out. And Antoine actually has the right move. It's rook to d3 here. So Maurice actually loves his Aikido chess, which is, you know, the thought that every move you play comes with drawbacks, and sometimes the best moves take advantage of those drawbacks. So the queen vacates the third rank, so the rook enters the third rank. The queen also stops, keeping an eye on the c8 square, so the rook leaves the back rank as well. And that is kind of the story here. So why is rook to d3 so powerful? Well, now we always have threats of rook b3 if the king were to ever step to the b file. And in this case, Hikaru tries rook to h4, and again, Magnus finds the only move, in this case because it's kind of forced, with queen to f5. Turns out queen to e1 check isn't going to be good enough here, because you do have to keep an eye on this h7 pawn. So queen f5 is still winning. Now Hikaru has to give up on checkmate and start defending his own king with the move queen to e2. If you were to play just some kind of passing move like rook to h1, the problem here is that b5 is actually coming on the board, and this knight is not going to be able to defend the pawn on a3, and that's going to cause you some pretty major difficulties. So queen to e2 played instead, but still b5 comes on the board, and in this case, Magnus plays queen takes g5, rook takes a3 was also fine, and Magnus now with an advantage is once again going to coast to victory. Down a piece, but in return has no fewer than 5 pawns, and the king is relatively safe. And I mean, if you're Hikaru, after blowing the winning position that you had, you're just not ever going to hold this endgame. And we see Magnus simply push the h pawn down the board and the e pawn down the board, and then in this position, Hikaru went ahead and resigned with h1 queen coming on the board. So what was Hikaru's mistake? He played this move d6, but I don't think we ever talked about, what he could have done to win instead. So that's my question for you, chat room. White to move and win in this position. Can you come up with a winning plan? Most moves are actually winning here for white, but it's tough to find the actual breakthrough. So that's my question to you, chat room. White to move, and can you find the way to break through? Can you find the way to break through here with white? And while you think about that, this, I wanted to say, is sort of the other prime example of a Hikaru Magnus game. In this case, Hikaru did it. He got out of the opening, he got a good position, and in this case, this is sort of the extreme where he was just entirely, completely crushing, completely winning. But that mental block against Magnus seems to come into play once again, and he just can't get the job done. Somehow, some way, Magnus manages to weasel his way out of it. Dead Channel says, possibly queen to c3 if the knight moves away, take the pawn and protect g1. So the problem with moving your queen away, I think, is that black is just going to play the move b5. And then with your queen over here on c3, the black queen is going to have some mobility again as well. Not something you really want to allow. Queen g3, rook h6. That's an idea I haven't checked. Surface level, that does actually seem pretty good. Let's see what the engine has to say about queen g. Okay, no, I expect that. Yeah, the problem with these queen moves is that black is always going to play queen b6. We actually saw this in the game here. In this position, Hikaru played queen g4 with the idea of rook h6, and yeah. Magnus comes up with queen b6 in response. So this is probably always going to be Magnus's reply. And now if you move the rook, of course, there are problems with your own king. So something better than queen g3. Great Wolf wants to go to the endgame, and that's just psychotic, Great Wolf. How are you going for the endgame here when your opponent's king looks like this and you have a pawn on g7? Absolutely not. Knight e7 doesn't quite work. It's not checkmate. We actually took a look at this move because king takes g7 is going to be surviving for black here. Andrew says king to a2, and king to a2 doesn't blow the win, but it doesn't win the game either. Show me the breakthrough. What's your breakthrough idea? Knight g3, knight h5, knight f6. Might be a little bit wishful thinking there. Might be a little too wishful. You're blundering your e4 pawn along the way, I think. Actually, maybe you aren't. Maybe you aren't, but maybe you are giving up something. I don't know. Knight g3, do I move the rook? Knight g3, knight d6 is the idea. And the point now is that we are able to find some counterplay over here, perhaps. So maybe it's not so easy. Maybe we should have some sympathy for Hikaru. All right, so the chat is finally arriving at the right idea. You know, all things considered, this d6 move doesn't look so bad, does it, right? We want to go d7 and we want to win the game. And the idea is that, of course, you know, black can't immediately recapture. Now, of course, in the game, rook d8 does somehow seem to work almost miraculously, right? It seems like with only 2 pieces on the board, we shouldn't actually be in that much trouble, but white is in some sort of awkward spot here. So the trick is not to give up on d6. This is sort of a lesson you can take away in your own games. If a tactic doesn't work, yes, you shouldn't sit there forever and ever and ever trying to make it work, but you should also be open to sort of amending your tactics somehow. And in this case, the best winning idea is to simply play the paradoxical move, rook to h1. Now, what's the point of rook to h1? Well, the point is black can do absolutely nothing to stop you from playing d6. And after you do, all of a sudden, now you can just play knight takes d6, rook d8, come back to f5, and guess what? You're not getting checked anymore. You're just not getting checked, and there's no way to stop ideas of knight e7 here. Like, you can play rook back to e8, but now you're just up a full piece as white. And so rook to h1, the sort of astonishing move that just kind of ends the game on the spot. I should also say d6, by the way, is threatening knight to e7 as well, not just d7. That was the move that was coming to my mind, but of course knight to e7, just as good here for white. And so rook h1 gets the job done. King to a2, as someone in the chat said, with a similar idea, isn't quite as good because if we do play d6 here, there is still going to be a queen e6 check we have to worry about. It turns out here that actually the white king is going to be pretty safe, but definitely this is a lot scarier. This is a lot scarier, right? I would rather not allow this at all and just have played rook h1. So king to a2 was actually a legitimate submission as well. But rook h1, super simple, and then white would have just completely crushed this game. So with all of this heartbreak, let's get back to the stunning quote-unquote conclusion of this rivalry. So, you know, up to this point, Hikaru definitely saw himself as one of, if not the top competitor for the World Championship title. He felt that he was the guy that should be taking the crown from Magnus back in the early 2010s. And it all sort of was coming to a head, right? At this point, not directly after this game, but leading into this next game, Hikaru's record against Magnus, I think, was 0 wins, 12 losses, and, you know, a bunch of draws as well. And so with all this talk of Hikaru, you know, getting up to number 2 in the world, but perhaps being the first American challenger to the unified world championship since the 1960s, all this talk, Hikaru needed to win a game against Magnus Carlsen, right? And that's exactly what finally happened for Hikaru. We're turning now to the 2016 Bilbao Masters, the tournament where it all happened for Hikaru, where he finally gets some sweet revenge against Magnus and wins a classical chess game. So let's take a look here. We have Magnus playing e4. Hikaru goes for c5. And we're going to end up in some kind of open Sicilian, with white doing some slightly funny things with the knights, but eventually, of course, breaking through with d4, and the knight coming to d4, and we get some sort of fianchetto variation for white, black fianchettoing as well, in a more typical Dragendorf type setup. Forgive me if I don't know the technical names for all of these random Sicilian lines. There's just so many names. Why do they name the Sicilian so many different things? They all look like each other too. But in this case, white fianchettoing, black fianchettoing in the open Sicilian. And here we actually see Magnus going way off book with the move b3. So apparently the way they typically play these games is to go a little bit more slowly with white, take control of the g4 square, bring the bishop out to the most natural square, and just play some chess, right? Gonna retreat this knight, keep pieces on the board, and try to occupy the center with this knight on d5, make use of this bishop support back here on g2. That's sort of the typical way that these games go. In this case, though, Magnus is the one playing some strange opening business with the move b3, which is kind of bold, right? You know, to open this diagonal in response to the bishop sitting on g7, but Magnus simply wants to contest this bishop sort of as quickly as possible. So Hikaru takes this opportunity, as you might expect, to try and break down these dark squares before Magnus can comfortably occupy them with bishop to b2. And so he's going to do this with the move knight to c6. Now, perhaps a little bit more common these days is the move bishop g4, trying to take advantage of the fact that h3 has not been played, but I'm perfectly happy with how Hikaru chose to navigate this opening. So we get knight to c6, take, bishop b2, and now queen a5. So Hikaru again, just applying some pressure to these dark squares here, looking for some tactics. Magnus plays the move knight to a4. Now we do see Hikaru opting to occupy g4 with bishop g4. The queen comes over to e1, and we see queen to h5. So this is some typical, you know, early 2010s Hikaru Nakamura stuff. He's keeping the queens on the board, maybe when he shouldn't, to try and get some stuff on the king side. In this case, queen h5 I think is definitely just a mistake, and the reason why is going to be shown in the game. I think here, if black simply captures on e1, black is not really going to have any trouble in this game. Black doesn't really have too many weaknesses to worry about, and in the future can just break in the center, move one of these pawns at the right moment, and without queens on the board, without any distinct advantages, black should be doing okay here. For example, if it takes back, something like knight d7, contest this knight. We see bishops come off the board maybe. And yeah, I just don't see a reason why black should be worse here. But instead we get queen h5. Now Magnus plays this move f3, and we see bishop h3 by Hikaru, trying to get the light squared bishop off the board, and again, some attacking chances on the king side. And now g4 by Magnus is the start of some really good stuff for white here. The queen comes back to h6, we see rook to d1, and now g5 is just a very awkward move by Hikaru, sensing the fact that maybe f4 g5 was going to be a bit of a problem in the near future for black. Hikaru tries to play g5 himself, occupying these dark squares. The problem is, this entirely cuts black's queen sort of off from the rest of the board, and for that reason, white is going to be a bit better in this position. And we see bishop back to c1, bishop g2, king takes g2, and now queen to g6. So, if you have the black pieces here, you might be starting to get a little bit worried with this queen on g6. And it's sort of really important to understand with both sides what black needs to do to break free. If black can find a way to break free, then of course black is very happy and can break free. But if white actually notices black's idea to equalize and bring the pieces back into the game, then white is going to be able to try and stop it. So what is black's idea after queen to g6? What is Hikaru trying to do to bring the pieces back into the game? Great Wolf says 12-0, Magnus adopted Hikaru. So of course, it wasn't 12 wins in a row for Magnus. There were many draws strewn throughout, 20 plus draws, maybe 30 plus draws in all the games that they played. But Hikaru had not won a game, and Magnus had won 12 throughout their career. Great Wolf says maybe h5. And yeah, h5 is a reasonable idea here for black, but it's not really going to do it, right? The queen is still going to be locked over on the king's side here. And it's not like it really wants to step to the h-file with a rook coming to h1 so quickly. And yeah, Jason does have the right idea. d5 is what black needs to be looking at. If black can achieve this move d5, break down white's light squared control, then all of a sudden this queen is actually a very active piece on g6, rather than the slightly stunted piece that we're looking at here. So in the game, Magnus plays this move h4, which is actually not entirely wrong. h4 is pretty nice to just start making some threats and force essentially g takes h4 by black. Or else, you know, h5 is just going to be very, very strong. Pinning this queen to the h6 square is not ideal. So after g takes h4, the point now for white is that you have entirely softened up these dark squares for black, and you're going to have some opportunities to push these pawns a little bit later in the game. But that being said, white has to do something very, very concrete in this position, or else black is going to be able to break free with this idea of d5. So white to move here, chat room. What's the best way for Magnus to keep an advantage? Michael says d5, weakens c5 and e5 though. And this is true, and this is perhaps something Magnus should take advantage of to try and prevent d5. Goatsnog says c4, and c4 is actually a perfectly reasonable move here. I think white is doing okay after c4, but there's actually something a bit better that Magnus can do. Something a bit better than c4. And yeah, Joseph has the right idea. You actually start with this move knight to b6, the rook moves, and then you can bring this knight to c4. And rather than just trying to stop d5 through brute force, in this case we're stopping it, meaning with a pawn, in this case we're stopping it tactically with the knight on c4. So of course d5 is just immediately losing to knight e5 when this queen is entirely trapped on g6. So why is this maneuver better than pawn to c4? Well, we are also getting this knight back into the game from the very sidelined position it had on a4. And so after knight to c4, it's really quite difficult to come up with moves for black. You can play h5, but white's going to simply respond with g5. And all of a sudden, you can tell you're starting to get a little bit rolled over here. Still no time for d5 with moves like f5 coming on the board. And white is simply doing quite well after knight to c4. Instead, though, we see Magnus get a little bit lax and play the move queen takes h4. And I'm not going to ask you to find the way to break through with black here. Of course, we need to play d5 at the first given opportunity. And after this, black is no longer worse. And in fact, white has to be pretty careful in order to not be worse off in the game. Now, in the game, Magnus, unfortunately, was not very careful and played the move g5. Trying to attack this knight, trying to make use of this f4 g5 plan that we saw working a lot better with the knight on c4. In this case, though, this isn't a threat yet due to the pin, and Hikaru simply takes on e4, starts ripping things open, and this attack is sort of now all in for Magnus. It was sort of a free attack in the previous case, but in this case, it's an attack in exchange for the entire center, and if it doesn't pan out, black is just going to be much, much better. And that's what we see happening in the game. Magnus plays f4, we see just e6 in order to stop f5, finally c4 to stop knight to d5, but Hikaru calmly, coolly brings the pieces into the game. Rook f to d8. Magnus, of course, is not interested in trades. He's going all in on this attack. And Hikaru, again, just very calmly reroutes the pieces to better squares. And there's nothing Magnus can do. This knight on d6 defends the pawn on e4. The f5 square is a bit of a hole. And black is doing very, very well with the extra one pawn, but of course it being a center pawn is pretty critical in this position. We see queen f2, and Hikaru again takes advantage of this pin with the move f5, cementing the extra pawn, and black is now, I would say, pretty much positionally winning. We see bishop b2, knight f7, take, and Hikaru actually smoothly sails smoothly to a victory in this game with control of the d file, the extra e pawn, and now a perfectly safe king. There's just nothing to worry about. This move is check, but Hikaru moves back, getting out of check. Very high level stuff. Rook f2, and now all of a sudden it's white's king that is under fire. Queen to h3, and Hikaru isn't even happy here, going for what is probably a winning endgame with queen h3. Simply queen to d1, understanding that this king on g2 is far weaker than this king on g8. Queen to e3 now, and e5 is just nasty business, finally ripping things open now that black is ready. Of course, if fe5 were to be played, there are many moves here. Knight takes e5 is winning. Simply rook g6 is also winning, with the point being that if rook takes f5, queen g4 picks up the rook, and there's nothing to worry about. So instead, Magnus plays queen g3, perhaps anticipating these queen g4 ideas. Rook to g6 is still played, and the pawn on f4 dies. Queen h5 is check, 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 and now knight g5. And white is just checkmated at this point. We get queen b8, king g7, a few pointless checks, but again, the black king is far too safe here. We see the king run to h8, control of the diagonal, control of the rank, and a pawn to block checks from this file. There's really no way to get at this king. Queen takes f5 is played. We get knight f3 check, king h3, and then queen to d6 is actually the last move of the game with dual mating threats. No way to stop both queen g3 or even rook g3 and queen to h6, both with ideas of checkmate. You can play queen g4, but that obviously is losing for other reasons. And with this, Hikaru finally broke the spell that he was under, where he was just unable to beat Magnus in classical time controls. And they've gone on to play a few more games. Believe it or not, this still remains the only win Hikaru Nakamura has against Magnus Carlsen in classically rated chess. Has not won a game since then in classical. Pretty interesting stuff to see, in my opinion. So hopefully you enjoyed this slightly deeper dive into the rivalry between Magnus and Hikaru back in the early 2010s. I'm a little bit over time now, so I'm gonna log off here really quick. If you're watching live, please tune in to Sabina's lecture, which is starting right now. Maybe it already started. Go watch them. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.